Okay, so this video is going to be about European immigrants and cattle trails. So we just finished talking about Kansas during the Civil War. So this is kind of after that period of the Civil War. And it's during this time that the population is going to dramatically increase in Kansas. And we're going to talk about the reasons why that happened. Okay, so our essential question for this video is what brought people to Kansas? So you can kind of probably already guess what it is, having looked at the title of this, but that's what we're going to talk about because the population of Kansas is going to grow dramatically. And so this is our essential question that we should be able to answer at the end of the video in our summary. Okay, so the main thing that changed or brought people to Kansas was this act passed in 1862 by the federal government. And it was called the Homestead Act. And what this act was designed to do was to get people to move to the Midwest and the West and create farms and provide them with opportunities. So what the Homestead Act did is it gave free land to people. It gave each person, it gave them 160 acres of land that they could farm. But in order to get that 160 acres, they had to meet two requirements. And the first one is that they had to make improvements to the land. So they just couldn't get the land and not do anything with it. They actually had to try to farm it. They had to build a house. They had to make, when we say improvements, just try to make it better, like it was being used for something. And then the second thing that you had to do to be able to get this land is you had to be a U.S. citizen. So you had to be an American citizen, or you had to promise to become one in the future. So if you came from another country, you could actually get this free land through the Homestead Act with the intent or the promise that you would go ahead and become a U.S. citizen in the future. So this is a pretty good deal, especially for a lot of people that lived in other places. So as you can imagine, a lot of people came to Kansas, and not just Kansas, but all other states to get this free land through the Homestead Act. And when we look specifically at Kansas, there are one group of people that came here that are really important to talk about, and that is European immigrants. So immigrants from Europe came from all different places. They came here to Kansas. They came from Germany, they came from Italy, they came from Russia, they came from Sweden, they came from France, and they came here for so many different reasons. And you probably remember we talked about this earlier. We talked about these push and pull factors. Tomorrow we'll look, or in the future we'll actually read about some of these communities, these push factors. So these are things that pushed people to Kansas. And so some of these things that pushed people, or I should say pushed people out of their countries, was maybe they were being persecuted, maybe their government was corrupt, maybe they didn't have economic opportunities or ways to take care of their families. And they came to Kansas because of these pull factors, and the main one being opportunities, that they could have religious or they could have freedoms that they didn't have in their other countries, but also, being able to say you're getting 160 acres of land to farm and make an opportunity. That was a big pull for a lot of people to come, not just to Kansas, but to the U.S. in general. So in Kansas, and we'll learn about this huge group of European immigrants are going to come here and settle and make this a place for them to call home. Okay, so that is the first reason of what led to the population increase in Kansas. So the second thing we need to talk about are the cattle. So these cattle trails, these were trails that went from Texas to Kansas. And the reason they went from Texas to Kansas is that people in Texas had a large number of cows, they had a large number of herds of beef, and they needed to get that beef to places back east, so places like, not even back east, but places like Chicago, places like Pittsburgh, and then further on the coast, the East Coast, like Pennsylvania, New York, and Boston. And because there are no railroads going into Texas, the closest railroads were into Kansas. And so people, they would go on what's called a cattle drive. So they would move and take the cows from Texas to the closest rail stations, which were in Kansas. And it would take about 30 to 40 days to do it. That seems like a lot of work, but the reason they did this is because of the money that they could make. So if they had one of these cows in Texas, it would sell for about $4. However, if they could get it to Kansas along the rail line where it would be transported and taken to places like Chicago or Pittsburgh or other places, they could sell that same cow for anywhere from $40 to $50. So they could literally make 10 times the amount of money. And because of that, this was worth it. And so what happens in Kansas is we have the creation of what are called cow towns. And so they're towns that develop solely just because they're taking care of or they're supporting these cattle trails, the people that are bringing these cows up from Texas into Kansas. And a lot of these are cities that we know of, cities like Dodge City, Salina, Abilene, okay, even into places like Wichita. And so a lot of places in Kansas developed because of this. If we were to look, here's kind of a map of these cattle trails. You could see that they start here in Texas and then they go up and into Kansas. They stop here at like places like Dodge City, and then they come up here in places like Wichita, Ellsworth, Abilene, okay? And there are a lot of other places, but you can see this pink, this is the railroads. These are the major railroad lines. And so literally these were some of the closest places that they could get to. And you know, if you're selling a cow down here for $4, but if you could spend 30 or 40 days walking it up to here to Kansas and make 10 times that amount at least, it was worth it for a lot of people to go ahead and do this. So these cow trails, you could see they would go all the way up. They went to other places like Wyoming and Colorado and into Missouri, but a lot of them predominantly went up into Kansas. But then these cattle trails, they end, they stopped. And there are three main reasons why. There's three reasons why. The first reason of why these cattle drives stopped going from Texas to Kansas was because of something called Texas fever. And Texas fever was a disease that cows would get, and they would spread it and they would eventually kill the cow, or they would get very sick. And so these cattle, or these cows that are coming out from Texas, you know, they would get near, you know, close to a farm, or maybe they'd get mixed up with some other farmers, and it would spread that disease. And so people who lived in Kansas, their cows started dying because of the spread of this disease. So people kind of got a little defensive because they didn't want this Texas fever to kill or destroy their own cows. Especially people coming up that they didn't know who they were or where they were from, and you know, kind of just trying to protect their cows so they didn't die. The second reason is that farmers actually started fencing off their land. You know, you can imagine if you're just taking some cows and you're following this path and trying to get it from Texas to, you know, up to Kansas, like Dodge City or Abilene, you know, you're going to go over people's lands. And there weren't a lot of fences, and people started getting upset because, you know, these cows are going through their land. They're eating they're grazing on their land, and so it takes that food away from their own cows, and it makes it really difficult for them to go ahead and raise their own crops. And you know, people don't want somebody else's cows going through their field and destroying stuff, so they started fencing off their land. And that was the second reason. And the last reason is because eventually the railroads are just going to make their way to Texas, to places like Dallas and San Antonio. And so if the railroad lines have made their way to these bigger cities, there's no point for people in Texas to march or take their cattle all the way to Kansas when they can easily, you know, quicker make their way to the cities and to the railroads that are in places in Texas. So yeah, that kind of makes sense. Okay, and so summary. So what does this mean for Kansas? And what this means is that we are going to see a dramatic increase in the population. With all of these European immigrants and other people coming to Kansas to homestead, land is going to be given away, 160 acres because of the Homestead Act. Population is going to increase. And then on top of that, at the same time, with these cattle trails And these cow towns being formed like Abilene and Dodge City and places that are going to be made bigger like Wichita. We're going to see these cities start to form and revolve around this, but they're still going to stay. People are going to come to these cities to work, to support the cow towns. And then once these people leave, they're still going to exist. I mean, Dodge City is still there today. I've never been there, but they call it the cowboy capital. And so these places are going to exist. And more importantly for Kansas, we're going to see this dramatic increase in population. Okay, so that's it for this video. Please make sure that you do answer the essential question in the summary. You're going to need to know that. You are going to want to know this as part of the weekly objective because you have to be able to summarize the basic idea of the population increase in Kansas. You got to be able to explain that. So please make sure that you're able to do that. Please let me know if you have any questions and I will help you. Thank you.